Go ahead.
Hello, I am Amanda Moreno from AquarianSpirals.com, and I'm going to talk to you today about the empath archetype through the zodiac. Thank you to Linda and EA Zoom for having me. It's been a little while since I've done a full-fledged lecture for y'all, and I had a little Pluto square detour, so I'm happy to be back. So what I always like to do is just start out by naming kind of my lens and bias and where I'm coming from so that you know whose worldview you're kind of opting into with this work. So I'm coming to you from the unceded land of the Coast, Duwamish, and Salish people of what's now known as Seattle. I am a Swedish / Lebanese / Mayan / Mexican person who identifies as queer and non-monogamous. I am also a person who has studied a lot about the way that the archetype of apocalypse exists in our society and culture and how we can deal with those things. So all of those things are perspectives and identities that will inform what you're going to hear from me today. I also want to just extend gratitude to Elaine LaJoy, whose book Empath as Archetype really kind of was a breakthrough period for me, gave me the foundation for work that I've been building around empaths and astrology in particular for several years. And I also need to give gratitude to Jason Hawley, who introduced me to the term narcissistic processes. So our intention today is to open up our understanding of what it means to be an empath or an empathic type. Both, for folks who really associate with that label, or for folks who have really sensitive people in their lives, or people in, the healing arts who want some more insight. And then to look at how the signs of the zodiac can help us understand the many facets of empathicness. And, also side intention is to look at cool images, which I've picked a lot out for this. So I'm going to start by just kind of breaking down some terms and ideas. So what is an empath? An empath is a person who absorbs other people's emotions and then experiences those emotions as if they were their own. Empaths are really highly sensitive to the emotional climates around them, whether from other people or sometimes landscapes or objects, and often take on the psychological and emotional and sometimes physical baggage of other people. So empaths have trouble distinguishing between other people's emotions and their own. And it's really important to understand that there is, that being an empath is very different from being empathetic, right? Being empathic is very different than being empathetic. Empathianism is different from empathy. And I'm saying that a couple times just because the words sound so similar and they get really mixed up in our culture. And so having empathy, being an empathetic person, is referring to a process of thinking first and then feeling. Right? So like if a friend is talking to you about a death in their family and what they're going through with that, and then you're thinking about what they're saying and you're referring it to your own experiences, or, you really love the person and you're feeling a lot of, just, I want to help them, you're feeling whatever you're feeling. The point is that it starts with the conscious experience, conscious identification. I know why I'm feeling this way. So they speak, you think about it, and then you have a response that's based in feelings and emotions. Empaths, on the other hand, being empathic, involves a process of feeling without thinking first. And so there isn't conscious awareness of what the stimulus is, or there isn't conscious awareness of where the emotion's coming from, or even that the emotion is coming from a source outside of the person. So, say you walk into a room and you're feeling fine, maybe you're feeling happy, you're feeling great, you're feeling full of energy, and then you walk into a room and suddenly you're overcome with, feelings of sadness or anger or whatever the case may be, or you're suddenly flooded with grief. And then, maybe 5 minutes later, a friend walks out of the bathroom sobbing and they tell you, that they've just learned that a family member died. And so you know, if you know that you tend to sponge other people's emotions, then you might be like, oh, okay, this is why the sudden shift in my own emotional landscapes. But say your friend left without saying anything to you. Say there wasn't that, filling in the blank of why the shift happened. Um, a lot of times when we have a strong emotion, we really, really want to know why. We really want to understand, right? It's very linked to our mental narratives. And so a lot of times with empathic processes, folks will sponge energy that doesn't belong to them, and then they add a script to it. I want to understand why I'm feeling this way. And that's just an example of the many ways that empaths can kind of personalize things that aren't theirs. Right. And so that's, just kind of based in that desire to understand why. And it can also, we can also then, grab onto scripts from our own experience and be like, oh, this must be because A, B, or C is happening again. So another thing that I just want to kind of mention and not go into, because my mind is not the best at regurgitating scientific concepts. But there are, ways that you can learn about this empath phenomenon, if you want to call it that, in science, right? So there's a podcast that I recommend to folks called Invisibilia that has an episode entitled Entanglement, where they talk about everything from mirror neurons, which is a real, physics phenomenon, to, chronicling the experiences of a woman who is, has really intense empath tendencies. And they also talk about things like synesthesia. So that all exists as well, but we're going to be coming at it more from the psychological metaphysical approach. So other terms to kind of break down in the beginning of our story here would be the Clairs. Meet the Clairs, the Clair senses, right? So we have like our 5 regular senses: taste, touch, see, smell, hearing, all those. And then we have the Clair senses, which are kind of like our extra sensory perceptions, or our nonlinear ways of perceiving the world. So clairvoyance is the one that, folks have been usually most exposed to, or they're the most familiar with. And it's the kind of perception that indicates that a person knows things through seeing, usually like in their mind's eye, that they will get images of some kind. Think of the stereotypical scene where a fortune teller like has their eyes closed and they're, I'm seeing you off in the garden. And so clairvoyance comes through flashes of imagery in the mind's eye, or pieces of memory that have to be deciphered. And in a culture that very much privileges and emphasizes seeing, we're often, I think, kind of conditioned to think that all of us see things in our mind. And honestly, many of us don't, or, it's fleeting. Then we have clairaudience, which is clear hearing, where we hear a message in some way, whether it's sounding like an internal voice or as if the words form in our minds in our own voice. Claircognizance, then, clear knowing, is I think it's one of the more tricky ways of knowing, because it is just kind of like you just know things, right? We can think of that as like a gut instinct. So it can be awkward sometimes for a person who perceives just through knowing, because oftentimes we want that kind of, like, oh, I saw the vision, or like I heard the phrase in my mind, right? Claircognizance, you just know things. Clairsentience, which is clear feeling, is knowing through feeling energies, vibrations, emotions of people, or places or things, right? So we're really tuned into that subtle energy / emotional realm. So clairsentience is also really tied to that gut instinct thing. But it's more in that like, oh, my gut is telling me this doesn't feel good, rather than like my gut is telling me the truth, or like I know the situation as it's in claircognizance. So most empaths tend really strongly towards clairsentience and claircognizance. There's that kind of blending of them. Like when I think of more stereotypical psychic energy, I'm thinking more of clairvoyance, which I would see as being more of an air sign thing. Like Aquarius is very psychic in that it can like assemble all those packets of information and see the future. Whereas the clairsentience is more of a water sign thing, right? And then claircognizance would be more fire. So empaths, clear feeling, clear knowing. So it's learning how to work with those gifts and learning how to interpret them and depersonalize them a little bit. That's very important. All right. So I want to talk just a little bit about empaths and early childhood experience, because I think that that's a fundamental piece in understanding the psychology of the empath. And I really recommend that if you're interested in this part of the presentation, that you check out Elaine LaJoie's book on the empath and the fan hero family system, which is based in the Enneagram archetypes. So an empath's experience of absorbing from the environment often just starts very early and unconsciously and uncontrollably. And so empaths aren't aware that they're doing that, right? I've already kind of said that, but oftentimes empaths grow up in somewhat or very unstable and chaotic family situations. And so their sensitivity is used to really navigate that dynamic and try and keep the chaos of the home environment at a minimum or try to keep it in balance. And when I'm talking about chaotic home situations, I think sometimes folks will believe that that must mean that there is abuse or violence or whatever. And that's not necessarily the case. It can be having parents that just aren't available. It can be, being one of many siblings. There's lots of different situations that create a picture of emotional chaos for a child. And we're also, not putting judgment into these things. But this leads to the empaths using their gifts and sensibilities in order to respond and adapt to whatever's going on in the family system. And so there's this early experience of learning how to play a role, of learning how to adapt themselves in order to, meet the need that's going unspoken in the family home. And also just to feel secure, right? Because if you can imagine being so aware of being tossed around in the waves from an early age, like you want that stability, you want the tossing to stop. And so that, that role playing, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to Libra, can translate to adult life relationships as well. And so again, this could be the death of a parent, this could be related to divorce, this could be related to, having a sibling who is chronically ill or has sickness that means that they get more attention, right? There doesn't have to be malicious intent on the part of the parents, although oftentimes an empath child has at least one empath parent. And what I'm referring to here is specifically a parent who doesn't know how sensitive they are and so is still playing out their own stuff related to, not having tools for dealing with how intense the emotional world is all the time. Okay, so let's bring astrology in. The astrology of empathianistic empathicness. Yes, I made that up. I mess with the word a lot because I do consider myself to be an empath, but I feel like there's a lot of baggage with that right now that I'm not comfortable with. And so I play with the word a lot because it's a label that I kind of struggle with and that I feel like people take too seriously, or maybe I take it too seriously. So, we come to the part of our astrology journey together, and I'm not going to give you like cookbook, you might be an empath if the type of material. I don't think it's that straightforward. It never is. And it would also be unethical, right? We don't want to say like, oh, a person has Pluto in the 12th house, they're an empath and they had a traumatic family, family life. That's not quite what we're going for. So the goal here is just to see how the astrological language can help us to flesh out and better understand empathicness in a chart or in a person, and to see the different ways that empathicness can be described. And as usual, astrology, gives us an excuse to talk about important things. So that's also a piece of what's going on here. Um, and then just keeping in mind that, like for example, Gemini in a chart can be, a strength or a weakness or a way of coping with trauma or a survival mechanism or, the way forward. So clearly lots of nuanced disclaimers there. And so the easiest place to start is with the water signs. Fairly obvious. Excuse me. Of the four elements, water is the one most closely related to empathicness because of its focus on the emotional body. And water is all about feelings and emotions, and the water signs tell us that story of how evolution happens through the emotional body, right? With this metaphor of Pisces being the ocean, right? And then Scorpio being the barrel of the tidal wave where we're getting tossed and turned about and everything's chaotic. And then Cancer being like the tip of the wave where we get to that point where we've been seeking differentiation and separation, and we get there and we have an identity, and then we're tossed back into the barrel of the wave and out into the ocean. So you could say that folks with a lot of water in their chart are probably prone to being naturally empathic. Again, not necessarily empathetic, but definitely empathic. And so that'll look like lots of planets and water signs, but could also be, heavy emphasis on the moon, Pluto, Neptune, or heavy emphasis on the water houses. And so these folks might perceive or express their emotion and feelings, or a bit more than others, or they repress it. It all depends on everything. So just kind of breaking that down a bit more, Neptune is definitely a major signifier of empathic tendencies, right? So Neptune as ruler of Pisces is itself, the planet or the force of boundarylessness and dissolution, right? Dissolving. It is nebulousness. It is getting lost in the ocean or, emotions. And losing touch with one's own individual identity, right? There's that lack of differentiation in Neptune. And, for example, Neptune conjunct the moon can often be a person who has very diffuse energetic boundaries, right? So there's lots that can get through there. And so I'm often looking for strong Neptune placement. Neptune conjunct or square the nodes of the moon, or Neptune in aspect to many planets when I'm trying to understand a person's boundaries in general. And that can be, energetic boundaries or their ability to speak up for themselves, right? Like establishing boundaries through speaking, or whatever the case may be. Again, it just all depends on everything. One of my favorite ways to understand astrology is using it as a developmental wheel, right? Starting with Aries and moving through the signs to get that feel for human development. So I'm going to take you on a little tour now. We're going to go once through the zodiac. And, I'll go more into some signs than others, because there's just more to say with this topic with some than others. And it'll give you kind of like a springboard for understanding your empathic nature or the way that empaths work. And we're actually going to start with Pisces instead of Aries, because the zodiac is, after all, a circle, and the experience doesn't just begin with the birth represented by Aries, but it's more of an emergence, right, from the Piscean void. Okay, so Pisces, the womb, the ocean, as we've already kind of covered, oneness, it's undifferentiated, it's the nebulous abyss. And so Pisces is that boundarylessness that we associate with empaths so much, and it's total lack of discernment. And there's incredible qualities to that, right? Like divine love and compassion and ultimate connection and ecstasy and bliss, but it can also be really confusing. And so Pisces, such a prominent and obvious indicator for empathicness, frequently represents that state of not knowing where you end and I begin. And so Pisces 12th house and Neptune signatures that involve the karmic axis in the chart can suggest really deeply entrenched patterns of boundarylessness, of taking on other people's stuff, and the despair that can come from there, and the grief that can come from there. Um, and it can also, it takes it to an extreme in that it can correlate with the experiences that make our boundaries go away, right? That just kind of blow us wide open, and create trauma or patterns that keep repeating, patterns of self-sacrifice, patterns of boundarylessness that keep repeating. And we know that Pisces and or Neptune in combination with Venus can make one significantly prone to wearing rose-colored glasses, and can indicate a need for boundaries and discernment in relationship. Um, Pisces Venus types can have a tendency to be able to kind of like sense through to a person's core and then get enmeshed with this process of trying to save a person. Empaths can probably relate to that a lot. And Pisces also has a shadow tendency of, clinging to fantasy, a fantasy about who we are, a fantasy about, what a relationship is, a fantasy about saving somebody. And that's in order to try to avoid the void, avoid the void. And one of the things that tends to be fairly common among empaths and maybe just humans in general, a lot of what we're talking about is just, human speak. Um, but because of the early childhood experiences of being so overwhelmed with emotions that they weren't really equipped to deal with, and that tendency to like trying to keep the peace, to keep the balance, the core wound of feeling alone is usually pretty prominent for empaths, because they have felt so different and because they've had to surrender not just their identity, but oftentimes the process of getting to know themselves in that quest to keep things balanced. And so that core wound of being alone is really significant. And when there's strong Pisces and Neptune, or we'll say that, like a 12th house Pluto in the chart, that awareness of the void is very pronounced. And the ultimate fear of being alone in that space is there. So there can be, again, that clinging to, especially the identity of savior or victim, which we'll talk about a little bit later, more in depth. So if we think of Pisces as the womb, whether it's, cosmic or motherly, it leads into Aries, which is birth, right? And one way to think of Aries is the courage and fierceness that it takes to exist, to be born again and again. And so Aries is all instinct, and there's no thought, only impulse, right? It's the very beginning stages of life before the conscious mind has developed. And so Aries, Mars in the first house of the chart can tell us about, our ability to initiate new activities, to initiate change in our lives. It can tell us about what we desire. And for empaths, Aries and Mars can really help us to understand ways we do or can stick up for ourselves. It can give us insight into areas of life where we can really focus on having experiences where we're just able to be ourselves. And it can also give us indications or, insight into how we might experience anger, especially as an empowering or protective force. So we can think of Aries as a definite tool for empaths. After Aries, we have Taurus. And Taurus is, the first of the earth signs and is very closely linked, at least in my mind, with physical empathicness, right? So we've been talking a lot about sponging emotions, but there are physical empaths who might, sponge somebody's pain or symptom, or hold that energy within their body. It's usually a little bit more complicated than that, and not as straightforward, but there are people, who will sponge other people's symptoms or conditions. So Taurus in the developmental wheel is associated with our first experiences of being held and feeling secure in that physical security manner. And so it has a lot to do with the physical senses, right? And we're quite literally in our day-to-day lives swimming in sensory information. So think of our, cellular structure and neuron networks, many of which actually just look like root systems, like the one in this picture here, right? Um, and the webs that connect, plant life beneath the surface and above the surface, right? Here's this as above, so below concept. And so Taurus is the process through which our neural networks work. Taurus is the process through which we receive information through our senses, and the vibrations of the world around us are included in that. And so with Taurus, we have that literal tendency an empathic type might have to possess other people's stuff, right? Again, we're talking about at the unconscious level. But then at the esoteric level, Taurus is associated with the etheric body, right? Imprints. If you think of our different energy bodies, which there's many different ways of understanding that. We have our physical body, and then like the area just around our physical body is the etheric body. And then we usually have like an emotional body, a mental body, a spiritual body. So Taurus is associated with the etheric body, the imprints that have come through all those other energy bodies and are kind of just like really close to the surface of our physical container. And as such, it's also associated with the feelings or emotions that are stimulated when outside input comes in through our etheric body, right? So then we have this process of personalizing what comes through, even when it's not our own. And with Taurus, it's sometimes holding it as well. So then as we start to learn about the world through our five senses, our brains continue to develop and grow, and we get to Gemini. And so as the sign associated with the mental functions of labeling and categorizing, and understanding, right, we start to develop conscious awareness. We start to have left brain development, and our perception, thought, speech process starts to gain force. And as a sign associated with labeling and categorization, Gemini also has to do with the stories we tell ourselves and the narratives that we have. And so in terms of patterns or karmic conditioning, sometimes Gemini can show up in the chart of an empath who's very prone to creating narratives around emotional contents that aren't theirs. Gemini signatures can also speak to ways that we compulsively try to know, right? Like everything a person is thinking, everything a person is feeling, everything going on in our surroundings. And you can imagine like a Geminian style empath in a relationship might, sense the emotional shift going on with their partner, maybe even before their partner has consciously registered it. And then they're trying to get information. What's going on? Why is this happening? How does this fit into my narrative, right? This is very third house Pluto, South Node of the third house, or Gemini. So this is, a defense mechanism based on a survival instinct. If I have more information, I'll be able to kind of predict how they're going to be feeling in the future, or what's going to happen to me based on this. And I can, then therefore adjust myself to try to keep the peace in the environment or in the relationship. And so I've often seen ways that strong Gemini signatures and empaths can lead to lots of rumination or escaping from emotions into the mind. And it's kind of like there's nothing that exists below the neck. So from Gemini, we head into Cancer. So water sign Cancer is associated with emotional security, right? And as such, it corresponds with that time in our life when, through the development of consciousness in Gemini, we recognize that we're separate. And it's a sign of differentiation and ego identification, and therefore a lot of, deep emotional insecurity based in that core quandary that we talk about in evolutionary astrology a lot, the desire to separate from source, separate from the womb, the mother, and the desire to return. And so that conscious awareness of separation is also key to empathian psychology, because empaths tend to feel their difference really strongly already, right? There's that core feeling of aloneness. And Cancer has that awareness, even if it's instinctive, of that inherent insecurity in our existence and how frequently things change, right? How frequently emotions change. And that awareness of the frequency of emotional change can actually be an asset to an empath, because for folks who get, swamped with emotions so much, remembering that it will change, right? That no feeling is final can be a really important tool in their kit. And then we also have that, Cancer is associated with overwhelm, right? Empaths very much get overwhelmed. I would say any of the water signs have that quality, but Cancer and Pisces in particular. Another piece about Cancer is that it is sometimes, it's one of the signs that's associated with an identity of being a victim. A really difficult thing to talk about sometimes, because being identified as a victim can be a really helpful part on the process of healing. And victimization, or the archetype of victim, really corresponds with Cancer, again, because we become aware of how we're at the whims of other people, of fate. Like, we need our parents to hold an emotional container for us. We need our parents to provide us with food, right? And so that fear of being a victim, or that feeling of having no control, is really inherent within Cancer. And one of the things that also comes to mind there is that Cancer and the moon are associated with our identities, right? And we cling to our identities out of a need for security. And one of the things that Elaine LaJoy brings up in her book is the idea of the drama triangle. You might hear of it referred to as the dreaded drama triangle. And it's three identities that, once a person has started engaging with one, they tend to flux between all of them, right? I am the victim, and then I become the rescuer, and then I become the persecutor and the victim. And a lot of our society actually engages in this process a lot. But there's this tendency that empaths have as well, to play the role of rescuer or savior, to try and save people, as a way of bonding, as a way of helping, whatever the case may be. And then sometimes they become the persecutor as well, or the bully. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. Was there anything else I wanted to say about that? Nope. Okay. So then we have Leo and the Sun and the fifth house. And so Leo, especially when it's tied into the karmic axis, can help us to understand where and how our need for recognition and validation and to be seen could have gotten shut down at a young age. Again, we're thinking of shadow Leo here. And Leo signatures that describe that story can also speak to underlying resentment and anger, and those potential bullying type of behaviors. Bullying is another part of that drama triangle that I just had up there. And so one way of understanding this is that empaths can often be very attached to or concerned with the idea of authenticity, right? Which is a very Leo thing as well. I want my authentic self-expression. But because there are all these emotional undercurrents going on beneath the surface, sometimes an empath, for example, just one example, will pick up on another person's emotional state before that person is aware. And then, under the banner of, you're not being authentic, I know what's really going on, they can get into bullying behavior. And so it's important to keep in mind that, not everyone plunges into the depths in the same way that an empath does, and not everyone has access to their emotional realities at that speed. And so it's very important to let other people have their own processes, rather than kind of like badger it out of them in the name of authenticity. All right. So with Virgo, you know, another earth sign that's concerned with the practical and the material. Virgo is trying to shift the subjective emphasis of the first 5 signs from, you know, from me into how do I relate with you? How do I connect with you? And so it is that archetype of crisis. And Virgo really helps us to understand the pressure we can feel to be perfect, and our self loathing patterns or inner critic or lots of nervous or anxious energy that we have. And because Virgo exists in the same axis as Pisces, it can help us to understand ways we've sacrificed ourselves or tend to put ourselves second to other things. And also, just the concept of Virgo in general really brings to the forefront that idea of discernment, right? Empaths need boundaries and discernment, and to figure out how to have those. So then we get to Libra, which is an air sign that I often see highlighted in charts of empaths who have tendencies towards playing those roles we've already talked about, right? Like based in that early childhood need to keep the peace. And so there is this core focus on having a really hard time figuring out who they are. And I'm talking mostly about, you know, Libra on the South Node, Libra on Pluto, or somehow linked into the karmic axis rather than just like a Libra sun in and of itself. And so Libra is about that, you know, diplomacy and harmony and keeping the balance. And with the shadow side of it, we get placation and loss of self. And again, with an empath, it's linked into that feeling of like, I need emotional security. And so I'm going to become whoever I need to become in this dynamic in order to keep things feeling calm. And so it can, you know, it can be overdone there to the detriment of justice and self-empowerment. And so Libra does bring in that idea of codependency, right? With which empaths, and I would say a lot of people in society in general, have a tendency towards, right? And for empaths, again, the root of it tends to be that fear of being alone. And so this meme that I have here says, codependency is the chronic neglect of self in order to gain approval, love, validation, or self-identity through another person. And this stuff really goes deep, and it very much is that role playing, right? Like, who do I need to be to make you love me? Because our society teaches us that you're nobody till somebody loves you. So that, you know, as much as I see heavy water, heavy Pisces, Neptune with empath folks that are like, hey, I think this is a thing for me, I also see a lot of Libra going on in general. So then the other of the very relationship oriented signs, of course, is Scorpio. And as a water sign, it has that obvious connection to empathicness, but it, you know, Scorpio teaches us about death and regeneration, but also the process of merging sexually or asexually. And Scorpio in and of itself perceives the undercurrents of human relationships. It perceives the undercurrents of what's going on at that emotional level in a given situation. And so it can help us understand our compulsive need to go deeper. And Scorpio can speak a lot to tendencies that folks may have towards being suspicious, right? Being suspicious, and then really, like, again, that bullying behavior, really pushing somebody to admit what they're really feeling before they're able to. So after the dark of Scorpio, we emerge into the light of Sagittarius, which is the fire sign that is, I mean, I think that Sagittarius is most related to a healthy expression of empathicness, or an empowered expression of empathicness, which, you know, spoiler alert, I would say that, you know, at this point, my belief, what I think is up, is that empathicness is really close to our true nature, is really close to like what humans, we're all empaths essentially. It's just been kind of systematically badgered out of us, and we don't have tools for dealing with our emotional selves. But Sagittarius is also, you know, where we find the theories of natural law that we talk about a lot in evolutionary astrology, you know, our inherent way of being in the world that is, you know, sharing and giving and receiving and honoring the interconnection of all things. And so Sagittarius is also associated with truth and belief, and folks with strong Sagittarius in their chart, particularly when it's involved in the karmic axis, can have many lifetimes of belonging to, you know, land-based or nomadic cultures that were inherently connected to those cycles of each other and the earth and cycles of knowing. And that knowledge of connection of all things, again, gets at the philosophical heart of what it means to be an empath. Right? To be an empowered empath is to know one's own boundaries and to have discernment, but also to be able to feel and adapt and relate. So then, you know, if in Sagittarius we have truth and beliefs, we come to Capricorn, which is the energy with which we build a society. And Capricorn is about structures and laws and conditioning, and psychologically speaking, it's about accountability and maturity and repression and denial and guilt. And so Capricorn signatures in your chart can tell you where and how you show up, and potentially where and how you repress shame and guilt, which is relevant to everyone, and how you can better develop your boundaries. Finally, we get to Aquarius. And Aquarius and Uranus are associated with the urge towards liberation and following one's own path of individuation, the path of becoming who you are. And so it's often associated with the trauma that occurs when one shows their difference. And folks with a lot of Aquarian patterns in the karmic axis are often quite linked into collective trauma, right? And so these kind of empaths might be really sensitive to collective events, more so than others. And so that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind as well. And so a little interlude here with empaths and narcissism. There are, from time to time, I'll see kind of like a bunch of articles or memes talking about how empaths attract narcissists. And you know, that's probably true to some extent, but I want to kind of explore it in a different way, and talk about ways that we can understand the shadow side of empath through understanding the narcissistic dynamics of the astrological archetypes. So, you know, what is narcissism, right? We can think of narcissistic processes as part of the shadow of these archetypes, and you know, for our purposes here, we're just going to focus on the psychological view of narcissism, not necessarily narcissism as a personality disorder. Again, this is a term that's thrown around very carelessly a lot of times, but narcissistic personality disorder is a thing, and that's not what we're talking about at all. We're talking about just the fact that many of us go through narcissistic processes in our life, periods of our life where there is more inward focus, where we are kind of stuck in our own stuff. And so psychologically speaking, narcissism tends to relate to extreme selfishness, a grandiose view of one's talents, a craving for admiration, a craving for recognition. In psychoanalysis, it's described as self-centeredness arising from a failure to distinguish the self from external objects, either in very young babies or as a feature of a mental disorder. And one thing that I think it's important to point out about empaths is that empaths do tend to get stuck in our emotions, which are very subjective. Empaths get stuck in the subjective, right? They get stuck in emotions. And so for my purposes, I really want to take any judgment out of the term narcissist, because it's not necessarily about blame, right? But it is just that kind of reality of getting stuck in the emotional body. And narcissism indicates early life rejection in some way. So it's usually a rejection of self-expression. So when we're young, we really need validation and reflection and recognition of the divine spark within, right? And so narcissistic processes tend to happen when we inflate ourselves in order to avoid a wound. And that can be very pathological, or it can be even very, very minor. All right. So lots of nuance again. And it's just when narcissism gets out of balance that it becomes destructive. So skipping forward. Oops, I'm still talking there. What I'm just going to do is talk about the narcissistic shadow of empathic tendencies by elements, right? Just something to think about, something that I kind of am just been riffing on my own and developing ideas about. So shadow empath stuff or narcissistic processes related to the water signs. Again, just getting stuck in emotions in general, right? This is the empath's core wound in a lot of ways. And so, where, as a practitioner, I tend to really encourage my clients to go into their emotions and feel them so they can be released. And sometimes what an empath really needs is the opposite. They need to zoom out, they need a distraction, they need to get out of their emotions. The thing that I think Elaine LaJoy does with her clients is she has them do sand paintings, right? So something that's just very soothing and just kind of working with empathic wounds on the archetypal level, on the mythic level, instead of going deeper into the emotions. Because there are those tidal waves, right? And in Cancer, the wound there would be getting stuck in that subjective focus just in general, right? Like intensely emotional states that tend to focus on the I, like the needs that I'm not having or what a victim I am. In Scorpio, it's getting stuck in emotions related to relational and power dynamics, right? So still often with that subjective focus. But like my emotions or our emotions as a couple, as a relationship, are the only things that exist. And they must be dealt with right now. And then with Pisces, there's again that attachment to the fantasy, the attachment to the ego in an attempt to avoid the void, right? But we're personalizing these things. So then shadow empath stuff related to the fire signs, I'm thinking about wounds of narcissistic inflation, which is a very Leo thing at its core. But there's this fiery resentment or rage there, right? Why didn't you see me? Why can't I express myself? Or, a need to be the center of attention or feel loved. And as I've already mentioned, we can see bullying tendencies that come out there, right? Because fire signs are very oriented towards authenticity. Shadow empath stuff related to the air signs. The air signs can be very full of hubris. I mean, especially Aquarius or tyrannical, right? There's this I'm the best. Like if we think about the Leo Aquarius polarity, there's this process of metabolizing our God complex that's trying to go on there. And having to keep ourselves in touch with humanity. So there's different kinds of empathicness, right? And one of them is what is called the sensitive scientist kind, right? And there's a real narcissism that can be involved there, which is like, I am better than others and therefore I don't want to be around them, or I'm the best, right? So we see that hubris piece there. And then more simply stated, shadow empath stuff related to the earth signs. With Taurus, it's more of the possessiveness, right? Like it's mine. I'm going to possess other people's emotional contents. Very unconscious process usually. With Virgo, we get into the, it's all my fault. There's something wrong with me. So that anything that happens, it's like, oh, I've done something bad. I've done something wrong, when maybe it's not about you at all. And Capricorn, very similar. I am responsible for everything. There is, again, just like a narcissistic process going on there, in that there's that inward focus of it all being about me when maybe it's not. Okay. So tools for empaths. I do a 6-week class on this. And if I had to break it down to 2 things, I would say that for empaths, usually grounding and boundaries are the most important things. But if we break it down by element, we can say, stones, oils, and herbs that are, remediations to things that are going on. So what stones are calming? What oils are soothing? What herbs help with, emotional releasing? Grounding practices, whether that's, visualizing roots going into the ground or walking around with your bare feet, connecting with earth. Physical nourishment, a lot of times I'll say, you know, water. Water is a good cure for a lot of things, but it can also be, you know, figuring out what your body is sensitive to um, and acting accordingly. Physical boundaries, and what I mean there is everything from, you know, putting a crystal grid in your home to sleeping in a different bed from your partner if that's something that your energy body needs. And then somatic experiencing, right, goes along with body work. So things that help the body to move energy through. Empaths very much need catharsis, which I have listed under water, but we can have physical catharsis as well as emotional catharsis. And so catharsis comes from a root word that means to purify, and it has to do with the process of moving energy through, right? And so with empaths, oftentimes they get stuck in the emotional body or energy is getting stuck. And so catharsis, crying, big full belly laughs, punching a pillow, going on a run is a really great way to just kind of keep the emotional body moving. Feeling and releasing without scripting. Loving kindness meditation is one of my favorite things for folks who are very, very, you know, just epitome of watery empaths, because it's a way of engaging the heart while also zooming out a bit. And then inner child work. And I think, you know, as with all people who are willing to just doing your own inner work and knowing your tells, knowing your triggers are really great tools for empaths. For air, communication skills are some of the best boundary work that an empath can develop. The ability to say, I need to go home now, or let me think about that for a little bit before I answer you. Being able to verbally communicate boundaries is important. Zooming out, as I've mentioned, learning about traumatic patterns. And then fire, we have creative catharsis. So catharsis through art, for example. Movement like Tai Chi, again, things that help with flow. And practices to help connect with intuition. And, you know, I think that living in our society, part of the challenge for many of us is figuring out the difference between our intuition, our emotional responses, and our triggers. And with empaths, we're adding a fourth into the mix, figuring out the difference between all of those things and other people's emotions. So learning how to tune into intuition is a fantastic tool for empaths. In closing, I just have some inspirational memeage. I love this quote on the left. The first piece, which is the most important, is that which comes within the souls of people when they realize their relationship, their oneness with the universe and all its powers, and when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells the Great Spirit, and that the center is really everywhere, it is within each of us. And again, this is just coming to this notion that empowerment as a very, very you know, sensitive person, as a person who is empathic, is super important, right? Because that authenticity thing, although it can be used in a bullying way, that's not the only process that it serves, right? And part of it is that when an empath is feeling really secure within themselves and aware of, you know, their own inner stuff and how to work with it, their presence serves as a way for other people, as permission for other people to be more authentic themselves. So in closing, here's some details about where you can find me. I have a website. I have a podcast. I will be running my Tools for Empaths class later this summer, probably in August, most likely. I'll be running my Deconstructing the Myth of Soulmate class late this year. It's a Venus retrograde class, so whenever that starts. And then I am a core faculty at Portland School of Astrology. We have awesome programs there, and I have some other things listed here. So that is all for me for now.